Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
I've got my first guest of the day on the line. The book, we're talking about Bountiful Empire, a history of Ottoman cuisine, 6 centuries of one of the most fascinating yet misunderstood empires, boiled down, see what I did there, boiled down into a single tome. I'm delighted to say that the author of Bountiful Empire, Priscilla, Mary, and I hope I'm saying this right, Isin, joins me live on the line now. Priscilla, are you receiving me?
Yes, I am, but call me Mary. I don't use the name Priscilla.
Oh, it's the publisher, isn't it? Trying to be all highfalutin, isn't it, basically?
Yes.
Whereabouts are you, by the way? Are you in Constantinople, as the saying goes?
I'm in Istanbul.
Yes. So tell me a little bit about then, because the Ottoman Empire, and, you know, the listeners will be bashing their heads against the wirelesses because I am that worst sort of creature, the armchair historian, and I am only just sort of getting into the Ottoman Empire, have always thinking that they are sort of over there, and they've always, because I've got a thing about the Franks, so therefore the Ottomans have always been sort of the other side. So if you possibly can, explain a little bit about what we're talking about here.
Yes, well, of course, until a few decades ago, the Ottoman Empire was, as you say, sort of on the margin, sort of never taken account of, and of course, it was very much in multi relations with Europeans, especially Italy and Eastern Europe. So. In fact, now there's a lot of sort of scholarship that they were much parallel worlds in many ways interacting, and it was founded in the very end of the 13th century. Yeah, and at first it was a small principality in Anatolia. Western Anatolia, and it sort of grew and grew, and then the Sultan Mehmet II conquered Istanbul in Constantinople, as it was, in 1453, and of course, from then it grew sort of rapidly. It moved into Hungary, was for more than a century was part of the Ottoman Empire, Egypt, and so on. So it was a vast empire, and that's really why the cuisine is so interesting, because it's so many influences. I mean, you don't get a rich cuisine in a remote mountain village, right? You can't expect it because their foodstuffs are limited. But you have a huge empire.
Awful lot of goat up there if you're in a remote. An awful lot of goats, basically. Yeah. Yes,
exactly. Well, but when you have a huge empire. And rich and engaging in a lot of trade, and you get exotic foods as far as India. They've got sugar coming from Egypt. They've got a huge range of climate and geography, and a huge range of foods, and of course the influences are very widespread. So the Turks themselves originated in Central Asia, so they have their own culinary specialities that. They brought in, like that paper-thin pastry known as yufka, and dairy foods were very important, yogurt, that kind of thing. And then the Turks sort of moved westwards. They were in Iran for a long time, and they were influenced by Persian cuisine. They were influenced by medieval Arab cuisine. When they got into Anatolia, especially after the conquest of Istanbul, they were influenced by Byzantine cuisine. And that's sort of just to give an example of the Byzantine cuisine. So the Byzantines, of course, were Christians. Yeah. And they had hugely long fasting periods, which totaled sort of 6 months of the year. During that time, they couldn't eat meat, they couldn't eat dairy foods, and so they were very specialized in vegetable dishes. and 6 months of the year is a long time, right?
Yeah.
You know, you have to make do with those. Of course, they made exceptions for things like caviar. You know, I mean, in a way, that's an animal product, but they didn't count that. But fish, for example, wasn't allowed for most of that time either. So the Ottoman cuisine, for example, they're focused on, you know, they had a huge amount of vegetable dishes, obviously influenced from, formerly Byzantine Christians. So that's and also a lot of salad.
Yeah.
And of course, Westerners who came, Western Europeans who came to Turkey in the past, they were horrified that the Ottomans were eating raw vegetables. They couldn't believe it. They said, you know, raw vegetables were only fit for animals, and it caused terrible diseases like plague and fevers. You know, it's hard to imagine today that raw vegetables were such a horrific.
Well, especially considering we've got a raw food movement, and it's fascinating because, you know, I called it Constantinople to begin with. You know, the Byzantines, it's the it's the Eastern Roman Empire, it's the Holy Roman Empire, it's a Christian stronghold, and then the Ottomans take over, and they bring in. I mean, you think of, you know, Mahmud II who cries when he comes when he takes over Constantinople because he wants to rebuild it, and he brings people into Istanbul, and he repopulates it, lets the churches open again, and you know, one of the the old city walls are supposed to be impregnable, and it's a Hungarian cannon. You know, it's a Hungarian armor who brings, you know, so they've got this cuisine that goes from, you know, the heavy sort of cuisine, because I have Hungarian friends, heavy Hungarian cuisine through to India. So there's a huge range. What this book also looks at, not only the breadth of cuisine, but how important eating was as a social occasion. And I'm not just talking about, you know, when there were, you know, before they decided to dispatch a couple of pashas or whatever, but in terms of for ordinary people and also military. So explain a little bit about that if you can.
Yes, I mean, food was just, I mean, it's hard to sort of comprehend the importance attached to food, you know, like, you know, the Sultan had a sort of an obligation. Of course, that goes back to, you know, the Romans also, you know, what was it? Bread and circuses. You keep the people happy. You make sure they've got their staples, right? Yeah. And of course, that's the same thing for any government, I suppose. You know, you have to keep people fed at least, right? So, of course, it was very important. So one of the first things that Sultan Mehmet did, and this is a report by, you know, he took on, you know, many Byzantine scholars, you know, were at his court. So this was a Byzantine historian called Critopoulos, and he tells how, of course, Constantinople was in a bad state at that time because the Europeans had destroyed it in 1204. They moved in, they took all the treasures, they smashed everything, and left it in sort of virtual ruin. Yeah. And it never sort of quite recovered. So it was in a sad, sorry state when it was conquered. And so Sultan Mehmet, he resettled farmers around Istanbul because the land wasn't being cultivated. He gave them, you know, the animals they needed, the seeds they needed, the plows they needed, to make sure the city was could be fed. And of course, it grew and grew and grew because it sort of recovered its former glory again. Well, you know, and it became a very important hub. You've got a huge population. You have to feed, you know, a huge population concentrated in a small area. Yeah.
I mean, at its height, of course, we've got, you know, it goes all the way to Yemen. I mean, is it Suleiman the Magnificent or the Great, when it reaches its apex, the Ottoman Empire, and they just got this ridiculously, I mean, you know, you think about how on earth did they do it in the age before internet, but, you know, they were managing to control this simply huge sort of landmass.
Yes, of course, you know, places sort of came and went a bit. I'm not, you know, but yes, to an extent it was really huge, and they made, you know, extraordinary efforts to sort of, because the Portuguese discovered the sea route around, because the Venetians controlled the spice trade in the Mediterranean. And of course, and the Ottomans were highly engaged with the Venetians in the spice trade. And of course, that was very important for them. The spices used to cross the Indian Ocean and go through the Arab lands and to the Ottomans. And, you know, they even started building a canal from the Red Sea to the Nile. in order to sort of improve their connections with India in their efforts to sort of compete with the Portuguese.
Yeah.
And of course, the Portuguese didn't last long, because then the Dutch and the British realised that they were making a packet out of the spice trade, so they moved in and sort of took over. And meanwhile, the Ottomans sort of were desperately trying to sort of keep their routes open. So then they also had plans to build a canal through Suez, but that never came to anything. And yes, I mean, it's very interesting, this history. And, you know, people like with the Venetians, okay, sometimes they were at war, but most of the time they were cooperating because of their, you know, important trade.
Well, for the Venetians, I mean, it's trade above everything, isn't it? That's the main thing. That's how they keep the city-state going. I mean, apart from sacking, you know, supposed to be going on crusade and then thinking on the fourth crusade, or was it the seventh, thinking, okay, we're not going to go to the Holy Land and we'll just sack Constantinople instead. But their trade, I mean, they are mercantile, aren't they, above everything else? So if they can do a deal, they'll do it. You know, they are, if you like, you know, the trotters, independent traders of the Mediterranean in the 15th century.
Yes. I mean, they're huge. They've got a tiny land area, no resources to speak of. Everything is for them. Everything is trade, and the Ottomans eventually became quite a big naval power. Though, of course, you know, they hadn't been in the early period, because they'd only got lands connected to the sea in the sort of the 14th century. But eventually they became quite an important naval power. Because a lot of the terminology you can see is Italian.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. So they were sort of very much sort of cooperating and learning from a lot of their sort of, you know, sea naval technology from the Venetians originally.
How important, I mean, just thinking when they get to the sea, does that open up a whole new range of influences for cuisine-wise? Because obviously, if you've got access to the sea, that means you can go fishing.
Yes. Well, I mean, of course, I mean, people were eating fish from, you know, river fish, like, what do they call it? Sheath fish. It lives in rivers. And, of course, the Turks were quite big in the caviar trade, in fact, because, you know, the Crimea was the Tatars, right, who are a Turkic people. And but the real fish sort of boom came after the conquest of Constantinople, because that's what people in Istanbul ate. You know, the fish that come through the Bosphorus is really extraordinarily wide in variety and huge amounts. And so they sort of became, especially the people who lived in Istanbul, they were just as keen on fish as the Greek population.
Yeah.
Although they weren't that keen on seafood, you know, things like prawns. Sultan Mehmet actually ate lots of prawns and caviar and stuff like that. But a lot of Muslims, they weren't very keen on seafood.
Yeah, indeed. It's
seafood and shellfish and so on. That was more of a Greek thing. But in Istanbul, of course, it's still a huge. Fish is a huge thing here in Istanbul, or still, despite of course, the environmental challenges for fish and.
In the book, you've got this fabulous thing, which is excuse my terrible pronunciation, but this is a wedding feast. Now, I got my first wedding invite for the season last week, but I think it's going to be a little bit. This is going to pale in comparison, this Spanish wedding to this particular one in the 11th century. It's Melik, is it Danis Mend and his bride?
Danis Mend, yes, it was a Turkish principality in Anatolia. Yes,
right.
Yes.
Can I just read through the list here, because I love how you found this. This is the late 11th century. This is typical of the Seljuk period. 1,000 sheep, the same number of lambs, 500 goats, 300 cattle, 100 camels, and 150 horses, as well as 10 tons of rice, 1 ton of butter, and large amounts of wheat starch, chickpeas, onions, dried fruits, almonds, and honey were used in its preparation. And the entire army, apparently, it was claimed they said that they fed the entire army of 31,000 men, stuffed and spit roast lamb, spit roast chicken and pigeon, boiled mutton, bruran, which is a dish of spinach and rice, sausages, meatballs, sheep's head dressed with garlic and vinegar, 3 kinds of soup, and also noodles with minced meat flavoured with vinegar and honey and sprinkled with Arnold's. This is quite something.
Yes, it is. I mean, and of course, yes, it is incredible. But of course, it's still the case. Not really with sort of urban people so much, but it is in villages in Turkey today. You know, you invite everybody. You know, I mean, once we were driving past the village, and my friends said, "Oh, you know, let's go in and sort of, you know, join in." And I said, "But you know, we're not invited." They said, "And we don't know the family." And I said, "Oh no, it doesn't matter." And that's the thing, you know. If you pass a wedding, you feed who. Okay, the food might be fairly simple, you know, a bit like canteen food, right? You know, huge cauldrons of, you know, some rice and a meat dish and a vegetable dish and a pudding, and it's quite simple. It's not an exotic spread, for example, but everybody comes and they produce these huge cauldrons of food, and anybody who walks in is fed. And that was the case. Of course, you're describing that description. He was a local ruler, and of course he had to feed his army. Would expect to be fed as well and join in, and anybody who was there. So of course you're talking about feeding thousands and thousands of people, and all the later Ottoman weddings were like that. You had huge; they lasted for, you know, sometimes weeks on end, and you had banquets for, you know, all the top knobs, you know, the government officials, of course, and sort of, you know, all kinds of sort of high-ranking people. But also you fed the army, you fed the you know, just the regular people in the city were expected to be fed and given a banquet. So every day there's banquets for different people. So everybody in the end gets to sit down, and maybe their food, of course, they didn't get the very fancy, expensive dishes, obviously, but they got, you know, a basic, you know, kebab and some rice and some pudding. You had to. Hospitality was such a big thing.
And not only hospitality, but also like theanthropy. I mean, there's this, you know, we tend to think, again, it's the Western way of looking at the Ottomans, that, you know, they're cruel visas and they're executing people and lopping off heads at left, right and centre. But there's a social program. If you are living in the Ottoman Empire and you are destitute, you will get fed. We would call them, I mean, I suppose they're the Ottoman version of soup kitchens or food kitchens. Begins with an I? Imets? Yeah.
Yes, and the foreign travellers, many of them, of course, stayed in these places. They weren't fancy inns where they provided bedding and what's that. They were safe places. If you're a merchant, you could safely, you know, because they had strong wall around countryside. Right. Because, of course, bandits had their eye on these merchant, you know, camel trains bringing in all these sort of exotic silks and whatever. So you had to stay. You stayed in these places, and they were. There was a soup kitchen in the cities as well, and anybody could turn up and be fed for at least 3 days, depending how long, you know, they staying. And what the foreign travellers who visited these places and ate there, they were so amazed, because everybody, they didn't care whether you were a Jew, a Christian, a Muslim, or whatever. Everybody could go in, and they couldn't believe this. These 15th and 16th century travellers were amazed by this. That you know, it didn't matter who you were, what you were. You just walked in.
What's the situation? Because obviously, you know, the Ottoman Empire crumbles in the end, and it looks towards Europe. It tries to become, obviously, you know, Ataturk brings in, you know, Turkey as a forward-thinking nation, etc. And there's books that are about, and it's looking to France, for goodness sake, for its cuisine. And you know, there are lists of Turkish cookbooks. None of this wonderful. So presumably they are turning their back on a rich and colourful past and looking to the West. You know, spoiler alert, big mistake. So has it only been in the past sort of 20 years or so, or even less, that people have realized, you know, the history, you know, the fabulous history of the Ottoman Empire. And I talk as I said before, you know, an armchair historian who's never really looked at the Ottomans before. I mean, Byron rocks up there for goodness sake and has a lovely time. I mean, so are we looking, you know, Turkey has turned its back on this. Is it now, as it becomes more than ever a sort of an important meeting place of East and West and all that, is it now rediscovering the wonders of A, its cuisine, and B, its history?
Yes, I mean, if you go into sort of, you know, provincial towns and, you know, villages, people were, and at home, you know, my mother-in-law was cooking Turkish food at home. You know, they were city people in Ankara, but they were eating their own food at home. But when you go to a restaurant in the 70s, you could hardly, you know, of course, there were kebab houses and things like that. I mean, it wasn't completely impossible to eat Turkish food outside the home, but there was a very limited range. And I remember, you know, you couldn't get Turkish coffee in a hotel in Turkey. No way.
Woof.
You know, you'd have to go to a little sort of backwater coffee house to get Turkish coffee. You couldn't get it in a fancy hotel or fancy restaurant. My goodness, they were all serving Nescafe, you know, in coffee in the 1970s and 80s. And then, and of course, it was very sad. You know, like at the cookery schools, they weren't teaching Turkish food, basically. Just a few things. I mean, you couldn't not teach how to make pilau, and you couldn't not teach how to make baklava, for example. But apart from that, it was all French.
Yeah. Yeah.
And but of course that isn't particular to Turkey. I mean, in England too, right? You open a cookery book in the 19th century, and half of it's French food. And I think the same in Denmark, as far as I know, Norway. Belgium.
I have a couple for my own pleasure. I have a couple of 70s cookbooks, like for Robert Carrier, you know, and the hostess trolley, and I've got them purely for the fashion, for what the hostesses are wearing, and there's some fabulous frilled shirts for the men's in the 1970s, but also the dishes. You know, it is seen. You know, pasta is seen as an exotic foreign dish, for example. What is your relationship with Turkey then? Because, you know, in the best possible taste, as the saying goes, you don't sound like a native of Istanbul.
No, I'm English, but I met my husband when I was a student. You know those student work camps they have?
Yeah.
And I just happened, you know, I applied when I was at university in England, and then I went to Holland, but my husband was there, and then I came for a couple of holidays, and I just loved, you know, his parents. And I didn't know anything about Turkey. I was terribly ignorant. It's sort of embarrassing to think of it now. But and then as soon as I graduated, I just moved here. We lived in Ankara for about 7 years. Then we moved to Istanbul in 1980. So I've been here 51 years now. You know, it's my home, of course. You know, when you come, you go to a foreign country when you're young. You make your friends, you get a job, you settle down. Everything, your family's there. Everything, of course, you know, it becomes your homeland. And then, of course, the food was so amazing, especially compared to British food.
Yeah.
You know, those awful. You know, like, you know, of course, roast beef is lovely, roast lamb and whatever, roast pork. Of course, it's lovely, those Sunday lunches. But the vegetables, isn't it, Giles? You know, those awful boiled cabbage, and you throw all the water away. And now, of course, we know, you know, so much of the goodness is in the water. You know, it's thrown down the sink. And, you know, no idea of how to cook a vegetable. Because I came here. My mother-in-law, my husband's uncle, was a ship's captain, and he was a brilliant cook. He sort of spent his time months at sea cooking madly. I learned a lot. I started collecting their recipes, and then, I don't know, I thought, I wonder what the history is. And at first, nobody could tell me anything. But when we moved to Istanbul, of course, there's a huge sort of, you know, all the big publishers are here, the magazines, the historians, the main historians are here. So then I started finding out, and they gave me a few books, because food history is quite a new subject of study.
Yeah.
And it sort of began here in the 1950s with a doctor who was very, very interested in food history. But it really took off in the sort of 1980s, really. And which is the same for many countries. You know, food history nobody cared about food. You know, historians especially didn't care a damn about food. They didn't attach any importance to it in the past. And then I started sort of reading whatever was available, and I just got hooked, amazingly hooked. And so, you know, I never wrote a cookery book. Anyway, I'm not a good cook. I couldn't, you know, and I cooked. I sort of cooked to stay alive, basically.
Yeah.
But the history was so fascinating, and it just, you know, the last 40 years, it's just been my obsession, really.
So everybody seems to be flying to somewhere via Istanbul at the moment, especially from not my part of the world, from southern Spain, because they've got direct flights now from Malaga to which is great stuff. If I've got 24 hours, or I've landed in Istanbul, what should I? And we've only got 2 minutes, Mary. So here we go. What if I want to grab something? If I'm in Istanbul and I want to grab something that is distinctly Ottoman, what would you recommend? If I've got a lunch or a dinner in Istanbul, and I want to, yeah.
Well, I would say pide, you know, which is very similar to the Italian pizza, and actually is recorded much, much earlier, you know, a flat leaven bread with a topping of cheese or whatever. In fact, it's recorded in the 15th century here, so there's a connection somewhere, but where, I don't know. And, of course, so you try a pide, right? You know, they put lovely toppings on them. That's delicious, easy to grab, you know, there's many of them. Of course, doner kebab. Of course, it's too well known. It's almost become a cliche, hasn't it? But you know that was it. That emerges in Istanbul as quite a high class open air food, you know, picnic food in the 16th century. I mean, doner, of course, is a classic, and kebabs, of course. You know, but really home food. It would be what you can try is these little sort of back street restaurants that the local tradesmen use for their lunch.
Yeah, in the same way that I would take you to a Venta for a menu del dia, you would take me to a little back place in Istanbul and go, right, this is what the locals are having, but be careful with the coffee.
You can get beans and rice, vegetable dishes with hardly any meat in them or no meat, sort of liquid, sort of stew-like dishes made of vegetables. They're very tasty. You know, they make a lovely lunch, and you're sort of tasting what people would more likely to eat at home. I've only got 50 seconds because we've been talking so much we've been talking for 28 minutes about Turkish cuisine, about Ottoman cuisine. The book is called Bountiful Empire. You can order it via our own virtual bookstore. Mary, are you on the social media? Can we find you online? Yes, I'm on Instagram. You can find me, Mary Isin, on Instagram and Facebook.
Marvellous. And the book is called Bountiful Empire, A History of Ottoman Cuisine. Go and order it, listeners, and open your minds to the wonder of the cuisine and get a bit of history as well. The only question, we've got 10 seconds. What are you cooking for the weekend then? What are you going to be eating this weekend, Mary?
What am I going to eat? I'm going to make dolma, you know, stuffed vine leaves. I put some in the freezer.
Mary, you're going to run out of time. Thanks very much for your time. Okay.